Greetings, aggressively gendered men, and welcome to Codex Compliant.
You'll ever wonder if GW ever released any other sci-fi games before 40k? The answer is yes, quite a few, and we'd like to talk to you about one of them today.
Spacefarers is a 1981 sci-fi skirmish game from Games Workshop, predating Warhammer 40k by 6 years and Warhammer in general by 2. It's notable in that it manages to be a game that wasn't written by any of the usual GW names of the 80s, yet still has an unmistakable air of GW grimdarkness. Its Wikipedia page currently reads essentially as, "This was a game designed to be used with the miniatures from the line of the same name. A review of the time said it was a good game for people who own those miniatures."
So how about we go into just a little more detail than that?
Around the early 80s, Games Workshop hit upon the idea of putting out some games specifically to go with the miniatures range from Citadel Miniatures. You are, after all, more likely to buy a greater quantity of goblins if you actually have something to do with them. The first edition of Warhammer would arise from this sort of thinking, as well as a very different version of the game that would eventually become 40k. However, this is also the logic that gave us Spacefarers, which, yes, Wikipedia page, was designed to be used with the model range of the same name. The Spacefarers miniatures range itself predated the game, with some of the minis showing up in promotional material as early as late 1979 just as generic sci-fi minis, and are very much of the era for Citadel. As in, they contain lead, have integrated bases, and are sometimes a little goofy, but in a very charming way. Plus, the late 70s vibe to the design is very fun. For once, we're shoehorning in a comparison to something from Blake's 7 or whatever into the script would actually be fitting. The range was mostly sculpted by Oldhammer staples, the Perry twins, with a few other things, like some of the robots, sculpted by Tony Ackland.
The Spacefarers miniatures are quite small by today's standards, or even by the standards of 80s Warhammer miniatures, but that's very much a product of the era. The manfish we previously talked about also have their origins in this time period, and are about the same scale. Additionally, many of the minis today suffer from a bad case of droopy gun. It can happen to anyone when they reach a certain age. And although I don't want to say it out loud lest I affect the market, and obviously the price varies depending on which model you're talking about, it does seem like it's not the most expensive model line to pick up the odd mini from in the modern day. Like, I got this still in bag Emperor of the Imperialist model for £6.50 plus postage. For a 40+ year old model, that's pretty damn good. I also painted up this Imperial Marine so we'd have one for illustrative purposes. I hope you enjoyed seeing him in this video, since I'm not sure how often we'll have an excuse to show him again. Interestingly, a couple of minis from this line, the security guards specifically, were originally from Citadel's Star Trek range, since if something was generic enough, it was not uncommon for minis from this era to end up in multiple different ranges. And yes, if you weren't aware, Citadel had a short-lived range based around Star Trek the Motion Picture. It is a range that I could spend an awful lot of money on collecting if I thought about it too much, so I just pretend it doesn't exist.
Spacefarers the game was written by Andy Merkin and Nick Henfrey with development help from Dave Morris. Although a lot of places online says Andy's surname is actually Murdin, so either everybody is wrong or the game's credits included quite an unfortunate typo. Spacefarers rules were apparently influenced by the games from Strategy and Tactics magazine, and was originally sold for £1.95. Based on a comment we found by Nick Henfrey, it appears that it was intended to be a simple game, one that could appeal to kids. A thing you may doubt as we start talking about the actual rules, but remember that tabletop gaming was in a very different place in 1981. Rules from back then were often written in an incredibly vague and obtuse manner compared to today. Comparatively, this was quite a simple game. It used d6s and d20s and measured everything in centimetres, with 1 centimetre representing 1 metre in universe, which doesn't really line up with the models unless everybody is supposed to be about 8 feet tall, but don't worry about it. Maybe everyone's just that tall in the future. It can happen.
The first oddity you'll likely notice when reading the rules is their use of men to describe a single infantry model. It makes the whole thing sound aggressively gendered for no real reason. It's just a little surreal. Men are classified according to their weapons and equipment they possess. Men who are unconscious for any reason. All men, whether or not they have moved, may fire. Once.
It is certainly a choice they made.
And if you're wondering, yes, there were female models in the model line from the very beginning. The sequence of play in Spacefarers consists of 7 phases. The recovery phase, where any unconscious models may wake up. The record of intent, where both players write down what their men are going to do during the movement phase. So, you know, if they're going to forego moving to get an extra shot or run or whatever. The movement phase, where each player moves or possibly shoots with their models, and as each model has an initiative value, it is done in initiative order. The firing phase, where models get to shoot, again in initiative order. The close combat phase, where anyone in close combat sorts out their business. The reaction phase, which is a morale phase basically. And finally, the end of turn phase, where you make 1 in 20 rolls to see if any smoke on the battlefield clears. Kinda feels like that could have been folded into the first phase, but we don't make the rules. They did.
But how did any of this actually work? Can you play Spacefarers in the modern day? Well, yes. Dice are in fact a thing you can still legally own, although we live in the UK, so who knows what tomorrow might bring. And the game can be easily played with pretty much any sci-fi models. You don't actually need the originals. So, since it's the first big crunchy thing, let's take a look at the movement phase. How far a model can move is defined by the armour that they're wearing, which gives them a movement value. You then adjust that value depending on what specifically the model is doing, so +5 for running, -1 for crouching or opening a door, -2 for a leg wound, that kind of thing. They also can't walk backwards. That's illegal. You then look to the movement matrix to see what movement speed the movement value correlates to. So, for example, a movement value of 2 means you can move 2 centimeters, a value of 5 means that you can move 4 centimeters, and a value of 9 means you can move 10 centimeters. Because who doesn't love your movement stat not being how far you can move, but being a separate abstracted value that requires a matrix to decipher? All simple, easy to remember stuff. You know, for the kids. Firing ranged weapons is similarly subject to, well, this nightmare of a table where you find the range you're firing at and total up all of the applicable modifiers. Some related to what the target has done this turn, some related to what the target is, and others related to what the firing model has done or is. So if the number you get is a plus, then you move 1 column to the right, making it a more difficult shot, and if it's a minus, you move 1 to the left, making it an easier shot. You then roll a d20, and which result you get will either miss or correspond to a body part, and that is the bit of the man you have shot. Amusingly, because the body parts are listed as body, leg, arm, head, in that order, it does mean the table is just a series of increasingly shorter statements of blah, blah, blah.
Close combat works via a similar but slightly different table, where the column you use is decided by the weapon you're using rather than range. The basic system works the same for hitting someone, except that a positive close combat modifier score is a good thing in this one, rather than being a hindrance as it is in shooting, because they did the table the other way around. Which is a decision they had to consciously make and will perplex me until my dying breath. However a model is hurt, you then go to the armour penetration table. You look to see what weapon was used and what armour they're wearing, roll a d20, apply the modifiers and see what the result is. This can be no effect, a light wound, a serious wound, or just straight up death. And of course wounds have detrimental effects on a model, and if they get enough of them, they'll be killed. There's more charts for this, obviously, there are always more charts.
Looking at the weapons and equipment themselves, you'll see a lot of familiar things that would show up in 40k, like bolt weapons, force swords, power gloves, and conversion beamers. Although, interestingly, you'll see many of the weapons are straight up using the same designs we saw in Brian Ansell's Laserburn. Which kind of makes sense for reasons that we're going to get into in a little while. Also, yes, there is power armor. It is a sci-fi tabletop game, there must always be power armor. Finally, morale for your troops is managed by the reaction phase, where if they are shot at, see a friend shot, or are exploded just a little, you take a man's initiative and add a d6 roll to it, apply modifiers, and the result tells you what they'll do, which ranges from nothing to running away or surrendering if running isn't possible. Obviously, there is stuff that we've skimmed over here. There's explosives, specialist skills, and even rules for robots and jet bikes. Sorry, jet scooters. But you get the general idea. The basic mechanics are not complicated, really, they're just buried behind a level of abstraction and tables that I imagine made it hard for even an experienced player to not have to refer to the rulebook at every step of every phase.
And that's before you even look into the optional advanced rules. No, I'm not sure I want to add limited ammo to the things I'm keeping track of. I'm too busy trying to figure out why turning 90 degrees whilst carrying a conversion beam projector with a serious arm wound means my model can't move anymore. Also, things like the armour penetration table really put in a big complication if they ever wanted to expand the game, since adding something as simple as a new weapon or armour type would involve a lot of numbers and it'd get very messy very quickly. But since the game was never expanded, I suppose that doesn't really matter. I guess this is all a trade-off. The game has very little in the way of stats. Models just have their initiative and their combat ability, which are randomly decided by dice rolls anyway. This means that all the nuance of what makes one model or piece of war gear different to another is instead shunted nearly entirely onto the various tables the game has, which is certainly different to the games we're personally used to, but makes what is fundamentally quite a simple game far more fiddly than it should be.
But what of the backstory, we hear you scream? What of the lore? Well, stop screaming and we'll tell you.
Spacefarers is set sometime around the 27th century. Maybe, it's not exact. And we get an always fascinating timeline of events, which includes a lot of dates that have been and gone. By the current year of 2023, we should have a moon colony. The Soviet Union, which is definitely a thing that is still around, should have invaded Iran, followed by a total nuclear war once the US started throwing its nukes around. Although it wasn't all bad, since we've also started mining the asteroid belt and truly harnessing the power of the sun with solar-powered satellites. We presume that they mean satellites that send power back down to us, rather than just solar-powered satellites, because, well, one of those is science fiction and the other is just how most satellites work. As time went on, humanity recovered from the whole nuclear Armageddon thing, and we began to populate the stars, and eventually the corporation with a monopoly on faster-than-light drives, the Sol Centauri Starflight Corporation, became the dominant trading and political influence in human space, with its owner eventually just declaring himself emperor, as one does. Wow, wouldn't it be terrible if in the real world there were megalomaniacs who were able to wield unimaginable power purely because they were just really rich? Truly, science fiction allows us to imagine the unimaginable. In time, rebellions formed against imperial rule, and by the point the game is set, many human colonies have freed themselves from its control.
This all meant that the game had 4 different factions you could play as. There's the Imperial Marines, who may or may not be encountered in space. The Dark Disciples, a faction with a generically religious vibe going on that have some quite silly hats. The Star Patrol, who are essentially space police, not to be confused with Star Patrol, the sci-fi role-playing game, or Space Police, the LEGO theme. And then there's a final faction that's just sort of whatever you want, to represent rebels or pirate gangs or whatever. There's some example forces in the book, but you're encouraged to make your own team, where you're given a set of unequipped men, who you then gear up from a budget of Imperial credits, with some factions having easier access to things than others. Your team can then gain or lose stats and members if you run them as part of a campaign, and there's even some introductory scenarios to get you going.
As we brought up previously, the game has a bit of Laserburn about it, a game by Citadel Miniatures' Brian Ansell that is part of the tapestry of things that would lead to Warhammer. We happen to have made a whole video about it if you're interested. Wink wink. Although one thing we didn't know when making that video was that it appears that Laserburn was originally pitched to be released by Games Workshop, but lost out to Spacefarers, meaning that Laserburn had to be released by Tabletop Games in 1980. To quote Spacefarers writer Nick Henfrey,
I do remember it came about because Dave Morris and I visited Steve Jackson and Ian Livingston at their Ravenscourt Park Games Workshop store. I think they only had the one then. And we were introduced to Brian Ansell. He had this huge wad of typewritten rules for a game involving figures, and Steve and Ian had this wacky idea that they'd sell a lot more figures if there was a set of rules to go with them. Brian had obviously spent a lot of time on his rules, but I looked through them and just thought we'd start again with a much simpler, slicker system, figuring that kids wanted something simple. And that was Spacefarers.
Brian would later confirm that the rules that he had in this meeting were Laserburn, suggesting the occasional similarities between the two, like the weapons, Imperial Marines, or having a faction of religious zealots, are really not surprising. especially since both their fluff borrows a lot from the melange of sci-fi elements that were floating around the tabletop scene at that point. Elements that would also end up in 40k, leading to Spacefarers feeling a little grimdark, despite not really having much to do with Warhammer 40,000 beyond being published by the same company.
Sadly, even though they are connected and stylistically feel a little similar, the Laserburn and Spacefarers model lines are not 100% compatible, since one is at 15mm scale and the other is at 25. Although, with some creative storytelling, some could be used together, so that doesn't mean that they need to be kept entirely separate. No one's gonna call the Star Patrol on you. In fact, the Spacefarers model line is even name-dropped as a potential source for models in the Advanced Laserburn rulebook. And whilst we're talking about Laserburn, the artwork for Spacefarers does have a certain Laserburn-y quality to it, largely because a lot of it is by Tony Yates, who also did most of the Laserburn artwork. Although Jim Pitts also provided some internal art for Spacefarers, which really stands out due to its shading style and pleasingly chunky proportions. Plus, I do always like it when you can tell that a piece of artwork is based on a particular model, or a model is based on a particular piece of artwork. Also have to appreciate Yates' cover art of a menacing robot with a grid background that makes me think of the old Sega Master System boxes, which is an automatic win for me.
So, how do we feel about Spacefarers? Well, it's not a game with a long and lasting legacy, and we can see why. It was a game that came out, some people liked, and then it went away without any further expansions. There are some things in there that would later show up in GW's more well-known sci-fi game, sure, but they were also not unique to Spacefarers, so any similarities between the two are, from what we can tell, purely superficial. Although one connection that is a little more solid is that in 1983's first Citadel compendium, we saw a little preview of Rogue Trader, the project that would eventually become Warhammer 40,000. And in there we're also told that the Spacefarers range would be reworked in order to coincide with that. Now, that didn't happen, since it ended up taking 4 more years for Rogue Trader to finally come out, and when it did, Citadel's mini-range was in a very different place. But it does mean that there exists an alternate universe where 40k Marines started off life looking like this. To be thorough, we did check out the contemporary review of the game mentioned on the Wikipedia page, which was in the Space Gamer, issue 46, and was by William A. Barton. It generally came down on the game being a pretty complete package, just with a few bits that didn't really make much sense, but was basically okay. You might need to house rule a few things, but that's fine.
If you enjoy SF miniature skirmishes, and especially if you own Spacefarers figures, Spacefarers should prove of interest to you.
And yeah, we can broadly agree with that, even if the hindsight of decades of game design innovation since have led us to feel less well disposed to it than William was. There are a bunch of rules in there that just feel like a first draft, and it's difficult to imagine how they survived even a single round of playtesting. Like how the modifiers and graphs swap direction between ranged and melee when they could have just had them both be the same. That's something that's purely in its presentation, and making the obvious change wouldn't actually change how the game was played at all, it'd just make it simpler to remember. But with a little house ruling, you could get something more sensible out of it, and it is, to be fair, a lot slicker and simpler than Laserburn, so it did its job, I guess. And we'd be lying if we said the model line didn't have a lot of charm to it. Plus, it is still interesting to see a GW-published game take on a sci-fi setting long before Warhammer, let alone Warhammer 40k, was a thing.
So it may be little more than a curiosity today, but Spacefarers was still a lot of fun to have a look at.
Thus concludes another instalment of why are you talking about this when you could have been talking about, I don't know, Gorka Morka or something instead.
If it helps, we don't know why either.
Howdy Space Cowboys! Before we do our self-promotion thing, we want to give a quick shout out to a couple of articles that were incredibly useful in making this video. That being Aelger's Downport's Spacefarers article and Goat Major's article featuring their full collection of the mini-range. They also gave us permission to use those photos in this video, so thank you very much, Goat Major. You can find links to both of those articles down in the description. Anyway, if you'd like to support what we do, then a simple like or comment helps us out with the old algorithm, and if you'd like to support us in a more concrete way that allows me to buy milk to put on my Frosties, then please consider signing up to our Patreon at patreon.com/snipeandwib for as little as $1. Plus, you'll get your name in the end credits, and you'll see these videos a little earlier. Regardless, whether you're a patron or not, thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you next time.